In the early months of 1945, it became evident to most observers that the Third Reich was facing an inevitable downfall. Contrary to its intended 1,000-year existence, the Allied forces had surrounded the country. While some Nazi leaders acknowledged the grim reality, the most ardent followers of the Führer clung desperately to the hope of victory. By December 1945, the Allied forces had made significant advances in both the Western and Eastern fronts. In the West, British, American, and Canadian forces successfully landed in Normandy, liberating substantial portions of France and Belgium. In the East, the Red Army had made progress in Poland and Czechoslovakia. Some figures within the German High Command, like Hermann Göring, contemplated seeking peace, but Hitler adamantly rejected any such overtures. While early German successes in the Battle of the Bulge and the death of President Franklin Roosevelt briefly buoyed Nazi hopes, it soon became evident that the Western Front was collapsing, and Germany was destined to lose the war. Nevertheless, Hitler clung to the belief that a miraculous turn of events could save his Reich. He concocted stories of fictional divisions arriving to rescue the war effort, and exaggerated the strength of the Luftwaffe against Allied air superiority. By January 1945, the Allied forces had gained complete control of the skies over Germany, subjecting Berlin to relentless Allied bombings. In 1944, the RAF alone had dropped over 500,000 tons of ordnance on Germany. Despite these overwhelming odds, Hitler and his staunch loyalists, hidden deep beneath the Reich Chancellery, clung to the belief that victory was still attainable. As the Soviet army closed in on Berlin, the Nazi forces resorted to desperate measures, conscripting young boys from the Hitler Youth and elderly men who were brainwashed into becoming cannon fodder. Children armed with Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons were thrust into the fray, but it was clear that these efforts were futile. Berlin was encircled and endured an unrelenting artillery barrage. The Soviets were determined to capture Berlin at any cost, resulting in approximately 80,000 soldiers killed and nearly 300,000 wounded during the battle. With Adolf Hitler dead and leading Nazis fleeing to the west, the German population left in Berlin, especially women and girls, faced unimaginable violence and cruelty. One of the reasons for this violence was the discovery of the full extent of Nazi atrocities as Soviet forces advanced. The Soviets liberated infamous death camps like Auschwitz-Birkenau, revealing the horrifying scale of slaughter. However, Stalin prevented the dissemination of Holocaust evidence among the Soviet population, as he did not want to highlight the Jews as special victims of Nazi cruelty. Instead, these discoveries were used to condemn Nazi Germany for violating the Soviet Union. As early as October 1944, the Soviets engaged in violent retribution against German civilians in places like Messdorf, where dozens of civilians and Allied prisoners of war were massacred. Young girls and women were subjected to brutal assaults before being killed. When Nazi forces recaptured the town and discovered the massacre, they used it as an example of Soviet brutality. In Dahlem, at a convent-run maternity clinic and orphanage, the inhabitants encountered two groups of Soviet soldiers. The first group behaved decently, but they warned of the second wave of troops that followed. Unfortunately, the warning was accurate, and nuns, young girls, elderly women, pregnant women, and new mothers were subjected to vicious assaults. Such violence was well documented, and reports sent to Stalin described how German women of all ages were victimized. In some cases, Soviet commanders executed soldiers for such acts, but these instances were rare. The prevailing attitude was that Nazi Germany had violated the Soviet Union, justifying any level of cruelty against German civilians. The Soviets believed this was a normal aspect of war. In Berlin, the scale of violence and abuse against German women reached horrifying levels. The first wave of Red Army soldiers engaged in combat and moved on, while subsequent waves reportedly committed many of the atrocities against civilians. According to some accounts from the city's hospitals, anywhere from 95,000 to 130,000 women fell victim to sexual assault. It is estimated that around 10% of these women later took their own lives due to the trauma. Men and boys who attempted to protect their loved ones from Soviet soldiers were often killed on the spot. Women and young girls would hide during periods of intense Soviet activity, venturing out only in the early mornings for food and water when the soldiers were often recovering from their alcohol-induced hangovers. Alcohol played a significant role in the level of violence employed, and some women tried to disguise themselves as older or feign illness to avoid assault. Russian war correspondent Natalia Jess stated that Soviet soldiers did not discriminate by age, as they assaulted German females ranging from 8 to 80. While wartime sexual violence against women is unfortunately not uncommon, the scale of violence against German women by the Soviet army was unprecedented. It is crucial to note that Polish, Ukrainian, Hungarian, and Soviet women also fell victim to these heinous crimes. However, German women, in particular, were often seen as spoils of war. Moreover, German women and girls became outlets for the frustrations of sexually repressed Soviet soldiers, and this violence was deemed acceptable by much of the Soviet command. The number of German women and girls assaulted is estimated to be around 2 million, with many enduring multiple assaults. The role of the Red Army in defeating Nazi Germany was vital, but the scale of its crimes against German civilians was a horrific act in cruel revenge, one that should never have been tolerated on such a massive scale by the Soviet command.